The cold wind whistled through the broken windows of the stage coach as Harriet Turner clutched her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, watching the desolate landscape of Arkansas pass by in a blur of autumn browns and dying greens. Her world had collapsed just 3 weeks ago, and now she was heading to Benton with nothing but a small carpet bag containing all she owned in the world. October 1875 was proving to be crueler than Harriet could have imagined. At 22, she had already endured more than most women twice her age. The stagecoach hit another rut, jolting her from her thoughts and causing the elderly woman across from her to grumble. "Not much farther to Benton now, miss," the driver called back, his voice barely audible over the rumble of wheels and the snorting of horses. "Should be there before sundown if we don't break another axle." Harriet nodded, though no one could see her response. Benton, Arkansas had been chosen simply because the fare was affordable, and it was far enough from St. Louis that no one would know her name or the scandal that had driven her away. Her father's gambling debts, his suicide, and her fiancé's swift abandonment when he learned she would inherit nothing but shame, all of it lay behind her now. As predicted, the stagecoach rolled into Benton just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the main street. It wasn't much of a town, a general store, a saloon, a small hotel, and scattered houses stretching out toward the surrounding farmland and ranches. "End of the line, folks," the driver announced, hopping down to open the door. Harriet was the last to disembark, her legs stiff from the journey. She stood uncertainly on the dusty street, watching as the other passengers were greeted by family or strode purposefully toward the hotel. No one waited for her, no one even glanced her way. The driver tossed her carpet bag down beside her. "Welcome to Benton, miss." "Thank you," she replied automatically, her voice barely audible. Night was falling quickly, and with it came a deeper chill. Harriet counted the coins in her purse, enough for perhaps 2 nights at the hotel, but certainly not enough to establish herself or find passage elsewhere. She had planned to seek employment immediately, but arriving at dusk complicated matters. With her bag in hand, she approached the hotel, a 2-story structure with peeling white paint. Through the windows, she could see a warm light and people gathering for an evening meal. Her stomach growled painfully, reminding her that she hadn't eaten since morning. The hotel proprietor looked up as the bell above the door jangled. He was a portly man with suspicious eyes that narrowed as they assessed her simple dress and single bag. "Room for the night?" he asked, his tone brusque. "Yes, please," Harriet replied. "And perhaps information on employment opportunities in town," the man snorted. "Ain't much work for women round here 'cept at the saloon, and you don't look the type." His eyes flicked over her again. "Room's 50 cents, dinner's extra." Harriet's heart sank as she counted out the coins. After paying for the room and a modest meal, she would have precious little left. She ate her stew in silence at a corner table, aware of curious glances from the other diners. In a town this small, newcomers were obviously rare. Morning came too quickly, and with it, the daunting task of finding work. Harriet dressed in her best, which wasn't saying much, and set out to introduce herself to the town. The general store had no need for help. The small schoolhouse already had a teacher. The dressmaker shook her head before Harriet even finished her question. By midday, desperation was setting in. She stood outside the saloon for several long minutes, weighing her options before her pride won out and she turned away. She wouldn't resort to that, not yet. As the sun began its descent once more, Harriet found herself at the edge of town, her options exhausted and her future bleaker than ever. She had 1 night left at the hotel, and then what? The October air was growing colder by the day. Winter would be coming soon. A commotion up ahead drew her attention. A group of cowboys had ridden into town, their horses kicking up dust as they made their way to the saloon. They were laughing and shouting, clearly in high spirits. One man, however, separated from the group and headed toward the general store. He was tall, with broad shoulders and sun-darkened skin. His hat shaded his face, but something about his confident stride made Harriet watch him longer than was proper. He disappeared into the store just as one of his companions called out, "Don't be long, Archer." "First rounds on Jenkins for losing that bet." Harriet turned away, her cheeks warming at being caught staring. She continued her aimless walk, eventually finding herself on a small bridge over the creek that ran along the edge of town. The water gurgled beneath her, indifferent to her troubles. She leaned against the railing, watching the last rays of sunlight sparkle on the surface. "Ain't safe for a lady to be out alone this close to dark." The voice startled her, and she spun around to find the cowboy from earlier. Archer. They had called him standing a few paces away. Up close, she could see he was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps in his late 20s. His features were handsome, with keen blue eyes that studied her with undisguised curiosity. "I'm perfectly fine, thank you," Harriet replied, straightening her spine. "You're new to Benton," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, I arrived yesterday," he nodded, as if confirming something to himself. "Archer Edwards," he said, tipping his hat. "My ranch is about 5 miles north of here." "Harriet Turner," she replied with a small curtsy, the habit of proper introductions too ingrained to ignore even in her current circumstances. "You got family in Benton, Miss Turner?" "No," she admitted, seeing no reason to lie. "I'm alone." He frowned at that. "Where are you staying, if you don't mind my asking?" "At the hotel. For tonight, at least." The words slipped out before she could stop them, and Harriet immediately regretted revealing so much to a stranger. Archer's frown deepened. "And after tonight," Harriet looked away back to the creek. "I'm seeking employment. I'm sure something will present itself." Her voice lacked conviction, even to her own ears. A long silence followed, broken only by the sound of the water and distant laughter from the saloon. When Archer spoke again, his voice was gentler. "Town's small. Not much opportunity for newcomers." "So I've discovered," Harriet replied with a bitter smile. Another silence stretched between them. Harriet was acutely aware of his gaze, but couldn't bring herself to meet it again. She should excuse herself, return to the hotel while there was still light to see by. "I should go," she said, finally turning to face him. "Where?" Archer asked simply. The question stopped her short. Where indeed? Back to the hotel, yes, but after that, when her money ran out. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, and she blinked them away furiously. "I have nowhere to go," she whispered, the admission painful but true. Archer studied her for what felt like an eternity. Then, with a decisive nod, he said, "Then my ranch is already yours." Harriet stared at him, certain she had misheard. "I beg your pardon, my ranch," he repeated. "It's a good size, productive. Got a nice house that's too big for just me. There's a room you can have. In exchange, maybe you could help with the cooking and such. My last cook quit 2 months ago, and I can't say I miss his food, but I do miss having regular meals." "You're offering me employment?" Harriet asked, still not quite believing what she was hearing. "And lodging," Archer confirmed. "It's nothing fancy, but it's warm and dry. You'd have your own room, your privacy. I've got 3 hands who live in the bunkhouse, but they're good men." Harriet's mind raced. On one hand, the offer seemed too good to be true, suspiciously so. On the other, what choice did she have? Another day in Benton would leave her destitute. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" she asked cautiously. Archer shifted, looking slightly uncomfortable. "My ma raised me to help folks in need when I can. Besides, I really do need someone to cook." The boys are threatening mutiny if I burn another batch of biscuits." A small smile tugged at Harriet's lips despite herself. There was something disarmingly honest about him, a straightforwardness she hadn't encountered in the men of St. Louis society. "I'm a decent cook," she said tentatively. "Better than decent would be appreciated, but I'll take what I can get," Archer replied with a grin that transformed his face, making him look boyish and charming. Harriet took a deep breath. "When would you want me to start? I'm heading back first thing tomorrow." "Could pick you up at the hotel around 8 if that suits you. Tomorrow. A new life starting tomorrow." The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. "That would be suitable, yes," Harriet agreed, her voice steadier than she felt. "Good." Archer nodded, seeming pleased. "I'll let the boys know we'll have company." He tipped his hat again. "Miss Turner, Mr. Edwards." He turned to leave, then paused. "Don't worry about the hotel bill for tonight. I'll settle it in the morning." Before Harriet could protest, he was striding back toward town, leaving her standing on the bridge with her heart pounding and her mind spinning with the sudden turn of events. That night, Harriet slept poorly, alternating between hope that this unexpected opportunity might be her salvation and fear that she was walking into something dangerous. But by morning, practicality had won out. Whatever awaited her at Archer Edwards' ranch, it had to be better than destitution on the streets of Benton. True to his word, Archer arrived at the hotel precisely at 8. He had a wagon rather than his horse, and he loaded Harriet's carpet bag with care before helping her up onto the seat. "It's not a long journey, but the road gets rough in places," he warned as they set off. Harriet nodded, clutching the seat as the wagon jostled over the uneven ground. They left Benton behind quickly, the landscape opening up into rolling hills dotted with trees displaying the vibrant colors of autumn. "Have you lived in Benton long?" Harriet asked, breaking the silence that had settled between them. "Born and raised nearby," Archer replied. "My pa staked his claim on our land back in '48, built it up from nothing. And your parents," a shadow crossed his face, "both gone now. Pa 5 years ago, Ma just last winter." "I'm sorry," Harriet said softly. "I know the pain of losing parents." She hadn't meant to reveal so much, but something about the open countryside and Archer's straightforward manner made it easier to speak truthfully. "Recently?" he asked, glancing her way. "My father, yes. 3 weeks ago. My mother died when I was a girl." Archer nodded, asking no further questions, for which Harriet was grateful. They continued in companionable silence for a time, the rhythm of the horse's hooves and the creaking of the wagon wheels creating a soothing backdrop. "There it is," Archer said eventually, pointing ahead. "Edwards Ranch." Harriet followed his gaze and saw a sprawling property come into view. A large ranch house stood proudly on a gentle rise, with various outbuildings surrounding it. Fenced pastures stretched out on either side, and in the distance, she could see cattle grazing. It was considerably larger and more prosperous looking than she had imagined. "It's beautiful," she said honestly. Archer's expression softened with pride. "Pa chose well. Good water, good grazing. We've been lucky." As they drew closer, Harriet could see 3 men working near one of the barns. They looked up as the wagon approached, curiosity evident in their stances. "That's Frank, George, and Daniel," Archer explained. "Good workers, all of them. Frank's been with us since I was a boy." The wagon pulled up in front of the house, and Archer hopped down before coming around to help Harriet. His hands were strong and sure as they spanned her waist, lifting her down as if she weighed nothing. The brief contact left her feeling strangely flustered. "Miss Turner." He called to the men who had abandoned their tasks and were approaching. "Our new cook and housekeeper." The men removed their hats, nodding respectfully. Frank, a grizzled older man with a weather-beaten face, spoke first. "Madam, you are a sight for sore eyes. If you can cook better than the boss here, you'll be our saving angel." Harriet couldn't help but smile at the warm welcome. "I'll certainly try, Mr. Frank." "Just Frank, madam, and this here's George and Daniel." George was a burly man with a thick mustache, while Daniel was younger, perhaps not much older than Harriet herself, with a shock of red hair and freckles. "Pleasure to meet you all," Harriet said, feeling some of her nervousness ease at their friendly manner. "Let's get you settled," Archer said, retrieving her bag from the wagon. "Boys, we'll see you at dinner." The inside of the ranch house was a surprise. Given Archer's rugged appearance and the general frontier setting, Harriet had expected a bachelor's Spartan quarters. Instead, she found a home slightly dusty and in need of a woman's touch, certainly, but well built and comfortably furnished. "My ma insisted on making it a proper home," Archer explained, seeming to read her thoughts as he led her through the main room with its large stone fireplace. "Said just because we were out here didn't mean we had to live like savages." "She was right," Harriet replied, running a finger along a wooden sideboard that was exquisitely crafted. "It's lovely." Archer showed her to a room at the back of the house. It was simple but spacious, with a bed, a chest of drawers, and a small writing desk beneath a window that looked out over the pastures. "This was my sister's room," he said, "before she married and moved to California." "You have a sister?" Harriet asked, setting her bag on the bed. "Two, both older and both gone west with their husbands. Haven't seen either in 3 years now." There was a note of loneliness in his voice that resonated with Harriet. Despite the ranch hands and his evident success, Archer Edwards was alone in the world, just as she was. "I'll leave you to get settled," he said. "Kitchen's down the hall. Help yourself to whatever you find. I'll be out with the men if you need anything." "Thank you, Mr. Edwards," Harriet said, the full weight of his kindness suddenly hitting her. "Truly, I don't know how I can repay such generosity." A faint flush colored his cheeks. "Archer, please, and a decent meal tonight would be payment enough for now." With that, he was gone, leaving Harriet to unpack her meager belongings and explore her new home. The kitchen proved to be well equipped but in desperate need of organization. Harriet rolled up her sleeves and set to work, determined to prove her worth. By late afternoon, she had cleaned the kitchen from top to bottom, taken inventory of the pantry, and prepared a hearty stew with the ingredients she'd found. The men returned as the sun was setting, bringing with them the sense of hard work and open air. They washed up outside before entering, and Harriet felt a flutter of nerves as they seated themselves at the large kitchen table, eyeing the steaming bowls she set before them with undisguised hope. "Smells like heaven, Miss Turner," Frank said, inhaling deeply. "Please call me Harriet," she replied, taking the seat Archer had pulled out for her. There was a moment of silence as the men tasted the stew, and then a chorus of appreciative sounds. "I think I might cry," Daniel declared, reaching for a biscuit from the basket Harriet had placed in the center of the table. "Best meal I've had since Mrs. Edwards passed," George agreed, nodding respectfully toward Harriet. Archer said nothing, but the look of contentment on his face as he ate was enough to warm Harriet from the inside out. For the first time in weeks, perhaps longer, she felt useful, appreciated, and safe. The meal passed with easy conversation, the men filling Harriet in on the workings of the ranch and sharing stories that had her alternately laughing and marveling at the dangers they faced daily. By the time she served the apple pie she'd found the ingredients for, it felt as if she'd known these men far longer than a single day. After dinner, the hands retreated to the bunkhouse, leaving Harriet and Archer alone. She insisted on cleaning up, and he insisted on helping, resulting in a surprisingly comfortable domestic scene as they washed and dried the dishes together. "You've made quite an impression," Archer commented as he carefully stacked the plates. "They're kind men," Harriet replied. "It's easy to cook for appreciative eaters. They're good workers, too. I'm lucky to have them." He hesitated, then added, "And now you." Harriet focused on scrubbing a stubborn pot, not wanting him to see the effect his words had on her. "I'm the fortunate one, Mr. Ed Archer. I don't know what would have become of me if you hadn't offered me this position. I think we might both benefit from the arrangement," he said simply. Later, as Harriet lay in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the night sounds of the ranch so different from the city noises she was accustomed to, she reflected on the extraordinary turn her life had taken. Yesterday, she had been facing destitution. Today, she had a roof over her head, work to do, and something that felt dangerously like hope blooming in her chest. The days that followed fell into a pattern. Harriet rose early to prepare breakfast for Archer and the hands before they set out for their day's work. She spent her mornings cleaning the house, which had clearly suffered from the absence of a woman's touch since Archer's mother had passed. Afternoons were devoted to cooking, mending, and occasionally venturing out to the garden that had once been carefully tended but had grown somewhat wild. Archer and the men returned in the evenings to substantial meals, which they devoured with flattering enthusiasm. After the hands retired to the bunkhouse, Harriet and Archer would often sit by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes in comfortable silence as he whittled or she worked on mending. It was during these quiet evenings that Harriet learned more about the man who had so unexpectedly become her employer and, increasingly, her friend. Archer had been just 17 when he'd fought briefly in the Civil War's final year, returning home with a scar on his shoulder and memories he rarely spoke of. He'd worked alongside his father to build the ranch into what it was today, taking over completely when the older Edwards had died. In turn, Harriet shared carefully edited versions of her own past her childhood in St. Louis, her father's business, omitting its eventual failure, her education at a ladies' seminary. She never spoke of her former fiancé, Henry, or the scandal of her father's suicide. Those wounds were still too raw, and she feared that knowing the truth might change Archer's opinion of her. As October gave way to November, the weather grew colder. Harriet found herself watching for Archer's return each evening with increasing anticipation. The sight of him riding in, tall and straight in the saddle, brought a warmth to her chest that she tried not to examine too closely. One evening, as the first snow of the season dusted the ground, Harriet was kneading dough for tomorrow's bread when she heard the door open. Archer entered, bringing with him a gust of cold air and a bundle wrapped in burlap. "Early today," she commented, trying to ignore the way her pulse quickened at the sight of him. "Got something for you," he said, placing the bundle on the table. "Open it." Curious, Harriet wiped her hands on her apron and untied the string holding the burlap together. Inside was a coat beautifully made of warm wool, with a fur-lined collar and delicate buttons. "Archer," she breathed, running her hands over the soft material. "It's beautiful, but I couldn't possibly—" "You can and you will," he interrupted firmly. "Winter comes hard here. That shawl of yours won't keep a bird warm, let alone a woman." Harriet bit her lip, torn between her pride and the undeniable practicality of the gift. "I can't accept such an expensive present." "It's not a present," Archer replied, his expression unreadable. "Consider it part of your wages." "My wages," Harriet echoed. In truth, they had never formally discussed payment. She had been providing her services in exchange for room and board, grateful simply to have a roof over her head. "You've been working hard these past weeks. Surely you didn't think I expected all that cooking and cleaning for nothing but a bed and meals." Harriet didn't know what to say. In fact, that was exactly what she had thought, and had considered it a fair exchange given her desperate circumstances upon arrival. "I've been setting aside what's fair," Archer continued. "Figured you might need a few things before winter sets in proper. The coat's just the first." Tears pricked at Harriet's eyes. It had been so long since anyone had looked after her welfare with such consideration. "Thank you," she said softly. "It's perfect." Archer shifted, looking uncomfortable with her emotion. "Try it on, then. Need to make sure it fits." Harriet slipped the coat on, marveling at its warmth and the way it seemed tailored to her form. "How did you know my size?" A faint blush colored Archer's cheeks. "Asked Mrs. Billings at the general store to guess. She's got a good eye for such things." The coat fit as if made for her, and Harriet couldn't help twirling once, enjoying the feel of the heavy material swinging around her. "Beautiful," Archer said quietly, and something in his tone made Harriet stop and look at him. The expression in his eyes caused her breath to catch in her throat. "The coat," he added hastily. "It suits you." "Thank you," Harriet replied, suddenly aware of how alone they were in the warm kitchen, the snow falling gently outside the window, creating a private world just for the two of them. The moment stretched between them, taut with unspoken things. Then Archer cleared his throat and stepped back. "I should go check on the horses before dinner." He was gone before Harriet could respond, leaving her standing in her new coat with her heart beating too fast and her thoughts in disarray. That night, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Harriet found herself studying Archer's profile when he wasn't looking. The strong line of his jaw, the way his hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, the capable hands that could both gentle a frightened horse and carve delicate wooden figures, he was a study in contrasts that fascinated her increasingly. "Something on your mind?" Archer asked, catching her gaze. Harriet flushed, embarrassed at being caught staring. "I was just thinking about Christmas," she improvised. "It will be here before we know it." Archer's expression softened. "First one without your pa, that's hard." The genuine sympathy in his voice nearly undid her. "Yes," she admitted. "And yours without your mother." He nodded, his gaze returning to the fire. "Ranch gets quiet around the holidays. Frank goes to his daughter's place in Little Rock. George has family near Fort Smith. Even Daniel heads to his uncle's for a few days. You'll be alone," the thought saddened Harriet. "Not this year," Archer replied, his eyes finding hers again. "Unless you had plans to go elsewhere." Harriet shook her head, ignoring the flutter in her stomach at the implication that he wanted her to stay. "No plans. No place to go, remember. This is your place now," Archer said quietly. "For as long as you want it to be." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning that Harriet wasn't quite ready to examine. Instead, she changed the subject, asking about the cattle and the preparations for winter, safe topics that carried them through the rest of the evening. But that night, as she lay in bed listening to the wind whistle around the eaves, Harriet allowed herself to consider what it might mean that her thoughts increasingly turned to Archer, that his smile could warm her from the inside, that she found herself looking for reasons to be in the same room with him. It was dangerous territory. She had trusted a man once before Henry, and he had abandoned her at the first sign of trouble. Yet Archer was nothing like Henry. Where Henry had been smooth and polished, Archer was straightforward and honest. Where Henry had made grand declarations, Archer showed his character through actions: the coat, the wages he'd set aside without her knowledge, the respectful distance he maintained despite the intimacy of their living arrangement. Harriet turned over, punching her pillow into a more comfortable shape. She was being foolish. Archer had offered her employment and shelter out of kindness, nothing more. She would do well to remember that and guard her heart accordingly. The weeks leading up to Christmas were busy ones on the ranch. There were cattle to move to more sheltered pastures, repairs to make before the worst of the winter weather set in, supplies to stock. Harriet found herself swept up in the preparations as well, making preserves from the last of the garden's produce, helping to smoke meat for storage, and turning the house into the warm, welcoming place it must have been when Archer's mother was alive. She also began, secretly, to work on Christmas gifts. For Frank, a new scarf knitted from wool she'd purchased on their last trip into Benton. For George, a batch of the molasses cookies he favored. For young Daniel, a book of adventure stories she'd found in town. And for Archer, something special. She had noticed him eyeing a particular silver belt buckle in the general store, though he'd put it back without purchasing it, claiming it was an unnecessary extravagance. Harriet had returned to the store alone the following week and bought it, using some of the wages Archer had insisted on paying her. It had cost nearly all she had, but the thought of his face when he opened it made the expense worthwhile. As Christmas approached, the weather worsened. Snow fell heavily, making trips into town impossible. The ranch became a world unto itself, isolated by white drifts that transformed the landscape into something magical and strange. 3 days before Christmas, Frank, George, and Daniel set off for their respective family gatherings, promising to return after the new year. Their departure left the ranch eerily quiet, with only Harriet and Archer rattling around in the big house. "Seems strange without them," Harriet commented as she and Archer ate dinner that evening, their voices sounding too loud in the silent kitchen. "Happens every year," Archer replied, though he too seemed affected by the sudden solitude. "Usually I take the opportunity to catch up on sleep." Harriet smiled. "A worthy plan, though I had hoped we might still celebrate Christmas properly. What did you have in mind? A special dinner, perhaps, and maybe—" She hesitated, suddenly shy. "In St. Louis we always had a tree. I know it's not common out here, but there's that pretty pine near the south pasture. You want to cut down a tree and bring it inside?" Archer asked, looking bemused. "We decorate it with candles and ornaments," Harriet explained. "It's a tradition from Germany that's become popular in the cities. My mother always insisted on it." Archer considered this for a moment, then nodded. "If it would make you happy, we'll have a tree." The next morning, true to his word, Archer set out with an axe and returned an hour later with a perfect small pine. Together, they set it up in the corner of the main room. Harriet had spent the previous evening creating ornaments from scraps of fabric, paper, and bits of ribbon she'd found in a sewing basket that had belonged to Archer's mother. "These are clever," Archer said, examining a star Harriet had fashioned from twisted wire and scraps of silver paper. "My mother was very creative," Harriet replied, carefully hanging the ornaments on the tree. "She could make something beautiful from almost nothing." "Like you," Archer said softly. Harriet paused, a paper angel in her hand, and looked at him. His expression was warm, admiring. "You've made this house beautiful again," he continued. "It was just a place to sleep before you came. Now it's a home." Harriet's cheeks warmed at the compliment. "Your mother created a lovely home. I've just tried to honor her work." "She would have liked you," Archer said, reaching out to hang an ornament on a high branch that Harriet couldn't quite reach. The casual movement brought him close enough that Harriet could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could smell the clean scent of soap and the outdoors that always clung to him. For a breathless moment, they were standing almost touching, his arm extended over her shoulder. Then Archer stepped back, clearing his throat. "Need some candles for that tree, I expect. Think there are some in the storeroom." He disappeared before Harriet could respond, leaving her with her heart racing and the ghost of his nearness still tingling along her skin. Christmas Eve dawned clear and cold, the world outside the windows a dazzling expanse of white beneath a brilliant blue sky. Harriet rose early, excited despite herself. It would be a strange Christmas, so different from the elaborate celebrations of her past. But there was something pure about the simplicity of it, just the two of them in this house surrounded by snow. She spent the morning preparing a feast, determined that their Christmas dinner would be memorable. A chicken roasted in the oven, filling the house with delicious aromas. Potatoes boiled for mashing, bread rose by the fire, and a carefully hoarded apple pie Archer's favorite cooled on the windowsill. Archer had gone out to check on the cattle, promising to return by midday. When he came in, stomping snow from his boots, his cheeks were red from the cold and his eyes bright with the same childlike excitement Harriet felt. "Something smells amazing," he declared, hanging his coat by the door. "Dinner's nearly ready," Harriet replied, wiping her hands on her apron. "I hope you're hungry." "Starving," Archer assured her with a grin. "But first, I got something for you." From inside his jacket, he produced a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with a length of red ribbon clearly saved from one of Harriet's ornaments. "Archer," Harriet protested, "we agreed to exchange gifts tomorrow on Christmas Day." "This one can't wait," he insisted, pressing the package into her hands. "Go on, open it." Curiosity overcoming her objections, Harriet carefully untied the ribbon and unwrapped the paper. Inside was a small wooden box, beautifully carved with a pattern of roses. When she opened it, a sweet melody began to play a music box. "Archer," she breathed, enchanted by the delicate tune. "It's beautiful." "Ordered it from back east months ago for Ma," Archer explained, watching her reaction closely. "Arrived too late, been sitting in my drawer ever since. Seemed right that you should have it." Tears pricked at Harriet's eyes. The gift was more than just a pretty trinket, it was Archer entrusting her with something meant for the mother he had loved. "I'm honored," she said softly. "Truly. But are you certain you don't want to keep it?" "It was meant for a lady's hands," Archer replied. "And I can't think of anyone more deserving than you." The simple sincerity in his voice touched Harriet deeply. On impulse, she stood on tiptoe and pressed a kiss to his cheek. "Thank you." For a moment, Archer looked stunned, his hand rising to touch the spot where her lips had been. Then a slow smile spread across his face, transforming it in a way that made Harriet's breath catch. "Best get that dinner on the table," he said, his voice slightly rougher than usual, "before we both starve." Dinner was a merry affair, with the chicken perfectly roasted and the pie declared Archer's finest yet. They ate by candlelight, the flames reflecting in the window glass and making the room seem magical and apart from the ordinary world. Afterward, they moved to sit by the fire, the Christmas tree glowing softly in the corner with its candles carefully placed and lit. Outside, the wind had picked up, sending gusts of snow against the windows, but inside was all warmth and comfort. "This is the nicest Christmas I've had in years," Archer said, stretched out in his favorite chair, a glass of brandy in his hand. "Even with just the two of us?" Harriet asked from her place on the settee. "Especially with just the two of us," Archer replied, his eyes finding hers over the rim of his glass. Something in his gaze made Harriet's heart skip a beat. She looked away first, focusing on the flames dancing in the fireplace. "It's different from what I'm used to, but lovely in its own way." "How so?" Christmas in St. Louis was. Elaborate. Parties, formal dinners, church services. Beautiful, but sometimes exhausting. She smiled a little sadly. "Though I suspect this year would have been different even if I'd stayed. Father's situation would have changed everything." It was the closest she'd come to mentioning the scandal that had driven her from her home. Archer said nothing, just watched her with those keen blue eyes that seemed to see more than she intended to reveal. "You don't talk much about why you left," he observed quietly. Harriet tensed. "There's not much to tell. Seems to me there's a great deal, but you don't have to share it if you don't want to." The gentle understanding in his voice was her undoing. The secret she'd been carrying these past months suddenly felt too heavy to bear alone. "My father killed himself," she said abruptly. "After his business failed and his debts were discovered, he'd been gambling, it seems, for years. No one knew, not even my mother when she was alive." The words came faster now, tumbling out. "He lost everything. The house, the business, our standing in society, and when it was all gone, he took his pistol and—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Archer set down his glass and moved to sit beside her on the settee, close but not touching. "I'm sorry, Harriet," he said simply. "The scandal was significant. People who had dined at our table for years suddenly couldn't meet my eyes. My fiancé." She swallowed hard. "Henry decided our engagement was no longer suitable. He had political ambitions, you see. He couldn't afford to be connected to such a scandal." Archer's expression darkened. "Sounds like you're better off without him." A bitter laugh escaped Harriet. "That's what I tell myself. But the truth is I was alone, completely alone. The house was seized for debts. I had nowhere to go, no family to take me in. So I gathered what little I had left and bought a ticket on the stage coach, as far as my money would take me." "To Benton," Archer said softly. "To Benton." Harriet nodded, wiping away a tear that had escaped despite her efforts. "And then to that bridge where you found me." "Where we found each other," Archer corrected gently. The distinction warmed something inside Harriet. She looked up to find Archer watching her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. Compassion, yes, but something more, something that made her breath come a little faster. "Thank you for telling me," he said. "It can't have been easy carrying that alone." "It's strange," Harriet replied. "I thought I'd feel ashamed telling you, that's why I kept it secret, but I don't feel ashamed at all." "You've nothing to be ashamed of," Archer said firmly. "Your father made his choices. Henry made his. Neither reflects on you. In St. Louis, it doesn't work that way. A woman's reputation is tied to her family, her husband." "Good thing you're not in St. Louis anymore," Archer said with a slight smile. "Out here, folks judge you on your own merits." "And yours are considerable, Harriet Turner." The warmth in his voice, the sincerity in his eyes, it was almost too much. Harriet looked away, focusing on the Christmas tree to compose herself. "It's getting late," she said finally. "I should bank the fire before we retire." Archer nodded, accepting the change of subject gracefully. "I'll check the doors and windows. Snow's coming down hard now." They moved around the room in comfortable domesticity, securing the house for the night. As Harriet carefully extinguished the candles on the tree, she felt lighter than she had in months. The burden of her secret finally lifted. At the foot of the stairs, they paused, suddenly awkward in the dim light of the single lantern Archer held. "Good night, Harriet," he said softly. "Merry Christmas." "Merry Christmas, Archer," she replied. For a moment, she thought he might say something more, might even reach for her. But then he simply nodded and turned toward his room, leaving Harriet to climb the stairs alone, wondering what might have happened if she'd been brave enough to linger just a moment longer. Christmas morning dawned with a blizzard in full fury. The wind howled around the eaves and snow piled against the windows, turning the world outside into a shifting wall of white. Inside, however, the house was snug and warm, with fires crackling in the main room and kitchen. Harriet woke to the smell of coffee and something sweet baking. Curious, she dressed quickly and made her way downstairs to find Archer in the kitchen, looking inordinately pleased with himself as he removed a tray from the oven. "Merry Christmas," he greeted her. "Hope you're hungry." "You're cooking?" Harriet asked, unable to keep the surprise from her voice. In all the weeks she'd been at the ranch, Archer had never once prepared a meal. "Trying to," he admitted with a grin. "Ma's cinnamon rolls. She made them every Christmas morning, recipes simple enough that even I can't ruin it too badly." Harriet peered at the rolls, which were perhaps a bit more brown on top than ideal but smelled divine. "They look wonderful." "Coffee's ready too," Archer said, nodding toward the pot. "Thought you deserved a morning off." Touched by the gesture, Harriet poured herself a cup and settled at the table while Archer arranged the rolls on a plate. Outside, the blizzard continued unabated, but in the warm kitchen with the scent of cinnamon in the air, it seemed distant and unimportant. The rolls were actually quite good, if a bit overdone on the bottom, and Harriet made sure to tell Archer so. His evident pleasure at her approval was endearing. "Weather's too bad to do much today," Archer observed, looking out the window at the swirling snow. "Might be stuck inside till tomorrow." "I can think of worse fates than being snowed in on Christmas," Harriet replied with a smile. After breakfast, they exchanged their remaining gifts by the fire in the main room. Archer's face when he opened the silver belt buckle was everything Harriet had hoped for: surprise, delight, and a touched expression that suggested he understood the significance of her having noticed his admiration of it weeks ago. "How did you know?" he asked, turning the buckle over in his hands. "I saw you looking at it in the store," Harriet admitted. "You seemed to want it but wouldn't get it for yourself." "It seemed frivolous," Archer said, "but I've always had a weakness for silver work." "It's not frivolous to have beautiful things," Harriet replied. "Life is hard enough without denying yourself small pleasures." Archer looked at her for a long moment, an expression in his eyes that made her heart beat faster. "You're right," he said finally. "Thank you, Harriet, I'll treasure it." In return, Archer gave Harriet a beautiful shawl of fine wool delicately embroidered with flowers. "To go with your coat," he explained. "Mrs. Billings said they were a set." The thoughtfulness of the gift, that he had planned it as a companion to the coat he'd already given her, touched Harriet deeply. "It's perfect," she said, wrapping it around her shoulders. "How does it look?" "Beautiful," Archer replied softly, and Harriet knew instinctively that he wasn't just talking about the shawl. The rest of Christmas Day passed in pleasant idleness. They read by the fire, played cards, and Harriet taught Archer a few simple Christmas carols that they sang together, their voices blending in the quiet house while the storm raged outside. By evening, the blizzard showed no signs of abating. After a simple supper, they returned to the fire, neither ready to end the day just yet. "I've been thinking," Archer said suddenly, breaking a comfortable silence. "A dangerous pastime," Harriet teased, looking up from the book she'd been reading. Archer smiled, but there was a seriousness in his eyes that caught her attention. "About what you said last night, about being alone." Harriet tensed slightly. "What about it? I know what that's like. After Ma died, this place felt empty in a way it never had before. Even with the hands around, I was alone. Then you came and—" He trailed off, seeming to search for words. "And," Harriet prompted softly, her heart suddenly pounding. "And it doesn't feel empty anymore," Archer finished simply. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Harriet closed her book, no longer pretending to read. "I'm glad," she said carefully. "I've been happy here." "Have you?" Archer asked, his gaze intent. "Happy enough to stay, not just as my housekeeper, but—" He took a deep breath. "Harriet, I'm not a man of fancy words. But these past months with you have been the best of my life. I find myself watching for you first thing in the morning, thinking of you throughout the day, looking forward to these evenings by the fire." Harriet could scarcely breathe. "Archer, let me finish," he said quickly. "I know it hasn't been long. I know you came here out of necessity, not choice. And I know a ranch in Arkansas is a far cry from society in St. Louis. But I care for you, Harriet Turner, more than I thought possible, and if there's any chance you might feel the same." He stood abruptly, moving to kneel before her chair, taking her hands in his. "I'm asking if you'll stay, not as my employee but as my wife." The world seemed to still around them. The crackling of the fire, the howling of the wind outside all faded away until there was nothing but Archer's earnest blue eyes looking up at her, his strong hands holding hers with infinite gentleness. "This is sudden," Harriet managed to say, though the truth was that her feelings for Archer had been growing steadily for weeks, perhaps from the very beginning. "Maybe," Archer acknowledged, "or maybe it's been building since that day on the bridge. When you said you had nowhere to go, and I knew, somehow, that you belonged here, with me." The simple truth of his words resonated within Harriet. She had come to the ranch desperate and alone, expecting nothing more than temporary shelter. What she had found instead was a home, a purpose, and now, incredibly, love. "I was engaged once before," she reminded him. "It ended badly." "I'm not Henry," Archer said firmly. "I won't make promises I can't keep. The ranch life isn't easy and I can't offer you the luxuries you had in St. Louis. But I can promise to respect you, to cherish you, to stand by you no matter what comes." Tears filled Harriet's eyes. "Those are the only luxuries that matter." "Is that a yes?" Archer asked, hope dawning in his expression. In answer, Harriet leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. It was a gentle kiss, sweet and full of promise. When she pulled back, Archer was looking at her with such wonder that it took her breath away. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll stay. Yes, I'll be your wife." With a sound that was part laugh, part sigh of relief, Archer stood, pulling Harriet to her feet and into his arms. This time when they kissed, it was deeper, a seal on the promise they had just made to each other. When they finally parted, both a little breathless, Archer rested his forehead against hers. "Merry Christmas, Harriet." "The best Christmas," she agreed, smiling up at him. Outside, the blizzard continued, but inside the ranch house, Harriet Turner had found her refuge, her purpose, and her love all in the arms of a cowboy who had offered her his ranch and, in doing so, had given her a home and a future she could never have imagined. The blizzard lasted 3 more days, sealing Harriet and Archer in their own private world as they began to plan their future together. They decided on a spring wedding, when the weather would be fair and travel easier for those they wished to invite. Archer suggested writing to Harriet's friends in St. Louis, but she shook her head. "There's no one there I need to see again," she said firmly. "My life is here now, with you." When the storm finally broke, leaving behind drifts taller than a man in places, Archer set about clearing paths to the barn and checking on the cattle. Despite the harsh conditions, they had weathered the storm well, a testament to Archer's foresight in moving them to sheltered pastures before the worst of winter set in. Frank, George, and Daniel returned in the first week of January, bringing news from town and their respective family gatherings. They were surprised but delighted by the announcement of the engagement, with Frank declaring gruffly that it was about time Archer found himself a good woman. As winter deepened, life on the ranch fell into a new rhythm. The days were shorter, the work different but no less demanding. Archer and his men focused on maintaining the herd through the cold months, while Harriet kept the house warm and welcoming, a sanctuary from the bitter elements. In the evenings, she and Archer would sit by the fire, sometimes with the hands joining them for cards or conversation, sometimes alone. They spoke of their hopes for the future of children to fill the big house with laughter again, of improvements to the ranch, of the life they would build together. Sometimes, in quiet moments, Harriet marveled at the turn her life had taken. From the brink of destitution to the promise of marriage to a man she respected and loved deeply, it seemed almost miraculous. Yet it had happened not by magic, but through Archer's simple act of kindness that day on the bridge, and her own courage in accepting his offer. February brought a brief thaw, allowing for a trip into Benton. Harriet needed fabric for a wedding dress, and there were supplies to purchase for the ranch. The town was largely as she remembered it, though it felt different now, no longer a place of desperate last chances, but simply a neighboring community. In the general store, Mrs. Billings, the proprietor's wife who had helped Archer select Harriet's coat, greeted them warmly. "Heard about your engagement," she said, beaming. "The whole town's talking about it. So romantic. The handsome rancher and the mysterious lady from back east." Harriet blushed, both at the description and the revelation that their story had become town gossip. Archer just grinned, seemingly pleased by the characterization. "Need some fabric for a wedding dress," he told Mrs. Billings, his hand resting comfortably at the small of Harriet's back. "The finest you've got, Mrs." Billings was only too happy to show Harriet the selection of fabrics, eventually helping her choose a beautiful cream-colored satin that would be simple but elegant. As they were completing their purchases, the door to the store opened, bringing with it a gust of cold air and a familiar figure. "Well, if it isn't Archer Edwards," came a feminine voice. "Still hiding out at that ranch of yours?" Harriet turned to see a striking woman in her late 20s, expensively dressed despite the frontier setting. She was looking at Archer with a familiarity that sent an unexpected pang of jealousy through Harriet. "Clara," Archer acknowledged with a nod that was polite but notably cool. "Didn't know you were back in Benton." "Just arrived yesterday," Clara replied, her gaze sliding to Harriet with obvious assessment. "Aren't you going to introduce me to your friend?" Something in the way she said the word made Harriet's spine stiffen. Archer must have felt it, because his hand at her back became slightly more possessive. "Clara Whitfield, this is my fiancé, Harriet Turner," Archer said, a hint of pride in his voice that warmed Harriet despite her discomfort. "Harriet, Clara is an old acquaintance." Clara's perfectly shaped eyebrows rose. "Fiancé, my, Archer, you have been busy since I've been gone." "Congratulations are customary, I believe," Harriet said smoothly, extending her hand. Clara took it briefly, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Of course. Congratulations." "How did you two meet?" "I don't recall a Turner family in these parts." "Harriet is from St. Louis," Archer supplied before Harriet could answer. "Now, if you'll excuse us, we have several more stops to make before heading back to the ranch." "Of course," Clara said, stepping aside but watching them with undisguised interest. "I'm sure we'll see each other again soon. Perhaps at the Founders' Day dance next month. I'll be in town until spring." "Perhaps," Archer replied noncommittally, guiding Harriet toward the door with a gentle pressure at her back. Outside, Harriet waited until they were well away from the store before asking, "Who was that, really?" Archer sighed. "Clara Whitfield. Her father owns the bank in Benton and half the businesses besides. We courted briefly a few years back." "She seemed quite familiar," Harriet observed, trying to keep her tone neutral. Archer stopped walking, turning to face Harriet fully. "It wasn't serious, at least not to her. She was passing time until something better came along. That something better was a wealthy businessman from St. Louis, ironically enough. Last I heard, she was engaged to him." "And now she's back," Harriet said, unable to completely hide her concern. Archer's expression softened. "And now she's back. But it doesn't matter, Harriet. Whatever was between Clara and me ended long ago. You're the one I want to spend my life with." The sincerity in his eyes dispelled Harriet's momentary insecurity. "I'm sorry, it's just, she's very beautiful and clearly from a good family." "So are you," Archer said simply. "Beautiful and good, the best person I know." Harriet smiled, her heart full. "How is it you always know exactly what to say, just speaking the truth?" Archer replied with a grin, offering her his arm. "Now, let's finish our errands and get home before the weather turns again." The encounter with Clara Whitfield might have been forgotten entirely if not for a letter that arrived at the ranch a week later. It was addressed to Archer, the handwriting feminine and elegant. Harriet recognized it immediately as coming from Clara, though she said nothing as she handed it to Archer along with the rest of the mail they'd collected in town. Archer opened it while they were having coffee after dinner, his expression growing increasingly troubled as he read. Finally, he folded it carefully and placed it on the table. "Clara," he said in response to Harriet's questioning look, "she's invited us to dinner at her father's house next week." "Us?" Harriet asked, surprised. "You and me," Archer confirmed. "Though I suspect the invitation is more for appearance's sake than any genuine desire to meet you." "You don't have to accept," Harriet said, noting his obvious reluctance. Archer sighed. "Ordinarily, I'd decline. But her father is on the town council, and we need their approval for the new bridge across Redbird Creek. If we can get it built, it would cut hours off our drive to market." "Then we should go," Harriet said decisively. "You're sure? Clara can be difficult." Harriet smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I grew up in St. Louis society, Archer. I know how to handle difficult women." The dinner at the Whitfield mansion, for it was indeed a mansion by Benton's standards, was exactly as uncomfortable as Harriet had anticipated. Clara had seated herself at Archer's right hand, leaving Harriet to make conversation with Mr. Whitfield, a corpulent man whose interest in her extended only as far as confirming she wasn't from any St. Louis family he might know. Throughout the meal, Clara made subtle references to her shared history with Archer, clearly designed to make Harriet feel like an outsider. She spoke of people and events Harriet couldn't possibly know, laughing at inside jokes that excluded her entirely. Archer did his best to include Harriet in the conversation, but Clara was skilled at steering it back to topics that highlighted her connection to him. By the time dessert was served, Harriet's polite smile felt frozen on her face. "So, Miss Turner," Clara said as coffee was poured, "Archer tells me you're from St. Louis. What brings you all the way to our little corner of Arkansas? It's quite a change from city life." The question was innocent enough on the surface, but Harriet could hear the underlying implication: what kind of woman leaves St. Louis society for the frontier unless she has something to hide? "I was seeking adventure," Harriet replied smoothly. "St. Louis can be terribly predictable. All those parties and balls, the same faces year after year. I wanted to see more of the country." "How brave," Clara said, her tone suggesting she found it more foolish than courageous. "And to think, you ended up in Benton of all places." "What a stroke of luck, meeting Archer so soon after your arrival." "I believe it was fate rather than luck," Harriet said, reaching across the table to place her hand over Archer's. "Some things are simply meant to be." Archer turned his hand to clasp hers, his grateful smile worth all the discomfort of the evening. "I couldn't agree more." Clara's eyes narrowed slightly at the display of affection. "Yes, well, fate works in mysterious ways. One day you're engaged to a businessman from St. Louis, and the next—" She trailed off, her implication clear. "The next you're back in Benton," Archer finished for her, his tone mild but with an edge that suggested he wouldn't tolerate further insinuations. "Life is full of unexpected turns." The rest of the evening passed in strained politeness. When they finally took their leave, Harriet felt as if she'd been through a battle, a genteel one fought with smiles and carefully chosen words, but a battle nonetheless. "I'm sorry about that," Archer said as he helped her into the wagon for the ride home. Clara was always difficult, but tonight she was particularly pointed. "She still has feelings for you," Harriet observed. Archer shook his head as he climbed up beside her. "She has feelings about losing me. Clara doesn't like it when things don't go according to her plan, and I suspect her engagement in St. Louis ended badly. So she came back to Benton hoping to pick up where she left off with you," Harriet concluded, "only to find you engaged to someone else. Someone far superior in every way that matters," Archer said firmly, taking the reins. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, both of them lost in their thoughts. As they neared home, Harriet finally broke the silence. "You think she'll cause problems for us?" Archer considered the question seriously. "Clara likes to stir up trouble, but there's not much she can actually do. Everyone in town knows we're engaged. The Hands have accepted you as the future mistress of the ranch. What matters is what's between us, Harriet, not what Clara Whitfield thinks or does." His assurance comforted Harriet, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that Clara wasn't done interfering in their lives. February gave way to March, bringing with it the first hints of spring. The snow began to melt, revealing patches of muddy ground and the earliest green shoots. The ranch came alive with activity as preparations began for calving season. Harriet continued work on her wedding dress, receiving unexpected help from Mrs. Billings, who proved to be skilled with a needle and generous with her time. The two women became friends as they worked together, with Mrs. Billings sharing gossip and advice about ranch life in equal measure. "Heard Clara Whitfield's been asking questions about you in town," Mrs. Billings mentioned one afternoon as they worked on the delicate beadwork for the bodice of the dress. Harriet's hand stilled momentarily. "What kind of questions?" "Where you came from, who your people are, that sort of thing," Mrs. Billings replied, her eyes never leaving her work. "Nobody knows much, of course, which seems to frustrate her considerably." "I don't have anything to hide," Harriet said carefully. Mrs. Billings glanced up, her expression kind. "Didn't think you did, dear, but we all have pasts, don't we? Things we'd rather leave behind." "Yes," Harriet agreed softly. "We do." "Well, don't you worry about Clara," Mrs. Billings continued. "Town's firmly on your side. Archer's well respected, and anyone who makes him as happy as you do is welcome in Benton." The older woman's support was touching, but Harriet couldn't help worrying. If Clara was asking questions, it meant she was looking for something, some weakness, some scandal she could exploit. That evening, Harriet shared Mrs. Billings' information with Archer as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset. The air was still cool, but the brutal cold of winter had passed, allowing them to enjoy the fresh air after being cooped up indoors for months. "Clara won't find anything," Archer said confidently. "And even if she did learn about your father, it wouldn't matter to anyone here." "It mattered in St. Louis," Harriet reminded him. "Benton isn't St. Louis, thank God," Archer replied. "Out here, folks judge you on your own actions, not your family's mistakes. You've earned respect by your own merit, Harriet. Nothing Clara can say will change that." Harriet wanted to believe him, but the shadow of her past still lingered. She had come to love the ranch, the town, the simple honesty of life here. The thought of losing it all, of losing Archer because of scandal, was terrifying. "Maybe I should be more open about my history," she suggested. "Tell people myself before Clara can twist it into something worse." Archer considered this, then nodded slowly. "If that would make you feel better, I support it. But don't do it because you're afraid of Clara. Do it because you're ready." His unwavering support strengthened Harriet's resolve. The next day, when Mrs. Billings came to the ranch to continue work on the wedding dress. Harriet took a deep breath and told her the truth about her father's suicide, his debts, her flight from St. Louis. Mrs. Billings listened without interruption, her kind face showing sympathy rather than judgment. When Harriet finished, the older woman reached out and patted her hand. "Thank you for trusting me with your story, dear," she said warmly. "It can't have been easy carrying that burden alone." "I'm not alone anymore," Harriet replied, thinking of Archer. "No, you certainly aren't," Mrs. Billings agreed with a smile. "And now you've got me on your side, too. If Clara Whitfield starts spreading tales, she'll answer to me, and I can assure you that's not a confrontation she'd enjoy." Harriet laughed, genuinely touched by the woman's fierce loyalty. "Thank you. No need for thanks. Now let's get this dress finished. You're going to make the most beautiful bride Benton has ever seen." As March progressed, Harriet found herself increasingly busy with preparations not only for the wedding but for calving season as well. The hands were working from dawn to dusk, and often Archer would come in long after dark, exhausted but satisfied with the day's work. The new calves were arriving strong and healthy, promising a good year ahead for the ranch. Harriet learned to assist with the easier births, finding unexpected satisfaction in helping bring new life into the world. The first time she held a newborn calf, still wet and struggling to stand on wobbling legs, she felt a connection to the land and the animals that she had never anticipated. "You're a natural," Archer told her proudly after she helped deliver a particularly difficult birth without his assistance. Most city women would faint at the sight. "I'm not most city women," Harriet replied with a grin, wiping her hands on a rag. "Besides, I'm not a city woman anymore. I'm a rancher's wife, or almost." "Almost," Archer agreed, pulling her into his arms despite her protests about the mess. "And I'm the luckiest rancher in Arkansas." The Founders' Day dance, mentioned by Clara during their encounter in the general store, was scheduled for the last Saturday in March. It was a significant event in Benton, marking the anniversary of the town's establishment and serving as one of the few social gatherings that brought together people from all the surrounding farms and ranches. Harriet was both excited and nervous about attending. It would be her first public appearance as Archer's fiancé, and she knew all eyes would be on them, Clara's most of all. The day of the dance dawned clear and mild, a perfect spring day. Harriet spent extra time on her appearance, wearing her best dress, a deep blue that brought out the color of her eyes, and arranging her hair in an elegant style she hadn't attempted since leaving St. Louis. When she descended the stairs, Archer was waiting in the main room, dressed in his Sunday best. The look of appreciation in his eyes as he took in her appearance made all the effort worthwhile. "You are the most beautiful woman I've ever seen," he said sincerely, offering his arm. Harriet blushed, pleased by the compliment. "And you are very handsome, Mr. Edwards." The town hall was decorated with spring flowers and ribbons, a fiddle player and a pianist providing lively music that had many couples already dancing when Harriet and Archer arrived. Their entrance caused a momentary lull in conversation, followed by warm greetings from those nearby. Mrs. Billings bustled over immediately, introducing Harriet to friends and neighbors she hadn't yet met. To Harriet's relief, everyone seemed genuinely welcoming, with several of the women expressing interest in calling on her at the ranch once the wedding was over. Clara, Harriet noticed, was holding court on the other side of the room, surrounded by admirers. She wore a dress that must have come from St. Louis or even New York, far more elaborate than anything else in the room. When she caught sight of Harriet and Archer, her smile faltered momentarily before returning, brighter and more determined than before. "Don't worry about her," Archer murmured, noting the direction of Harriet's gaze. "Let's dance." He led her onto the floor just as the musicians struck up a waltz. Archer proved to be a surprisingly good dancer, leading Harriet with confidence and grace that belied his usual rugged demeanor. "Where did you learn to waltz?" Harriet asked, delighted. "Ma insisted all her children learn," Archer replied with a smile. "Said just because we lived on a ranch didn't mean we had to be uncultured." "She was a wise woman," Harriet said, enjoying the sensation of being guided around the floor in his strong arms. They danced several more dances before taking a break for refreshments. Archer was pulled into a conversation with some of the town's businessmen, leaving Harriet momentarily alone near the punch bowl. It was an opportunity Clara didn't waste. "Miss Turner," she said, approaching with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "How lovely to see you again. Enjoying the dance?" "Very much," Harriet replied politely. "The town has been most welcoming." "Yes, Benton is known for its hospitality," Clara agreed, "especially to those in need of a fresh start." There was a meaningful emphasis on the last words that made Harriet tense. "Everyone needs a fresh start at some point in their lives," Harriet replied evenly. "Wouldn't you agree, Miss Whitfield?" Clara's smile tightened. "Perhaps, though some fresh starts are more necessary than others." She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "I received the most interesting letter from a friend in St. Louis recently. It seems the name Turner is somewhat notorious there at present." Harriet's heart sank, but she kept her expression neutral. "Is that so?" Yes. Something about debts and scandal. A suicide, I believe." Clara watched Harriet closely, clearly hoping for a reaction. "My father took his own life after his business failed," Harriet said steadily, refusing to be intimidated. "It was a tragedy for which I make no apologies." Clara seemed taken aback by Harriet's directness. She had clearly expected denial or distress, not calm acknowledgement. "You don't deny it, then?" "Why would I? It's the truth, a painful one, but the truth nonetheless." "And does Archer know about this?" "Truth?" Clara asked, recovering her composure. "Of course. I keep no secrets from my fiancé." This was clearly not the response Clara had anticipated. She frowned, momentarily at a loss, then rallied. "Well, it's good that he's so understanding. Not everyone would be, taking on a bride with such a history." "Archer judges people by their character, not their circumstances," Harriet replied. "It's one of the many reasons I love him." Clara's eyes narrowed at that. "Love is a luxury, Miss Turner. Security is what matters in the end. Believe me, I know." Before Harriet could respond, Archer appeared at her side, his hand coming to rest protectively at the small of her back. "Clara," he acknowledged, "I see you've been keeping my fiancée company." "Just getting to know her better," Clara replied with a brittle smile. "You've chosen a woman with quite a background, Archer." "I've chosen a woman with courage, integrity, and a heart bigger than all of Benton," Archer said firmly. "Now, if you'll excuse us, this is one of my favorite tunes." He led Harriet back to the dance floor, leaving Clara standing alone by the punch bowl, her expression a mixture of frustration and calculation. "What did she say to you?" Archer asked once they were safely among the other dancers. "She knows about my father," Harriet replied quietly. "Apparently she has friends in St. Louis who wrote to her." Archer's jaw tightened. "I'm sorry, Harriet. I should have expected something like this from her." "It doesn't matter," Harriet assured him. "I told her the truth. I'm not ashamed of who I am or where I came from." The look of pride and love in Archer's eyes warmed Harriet to her core. "Have I told you today how much I love you?" he asked. "You could stand to mention it again," Harriet replied with a small smile. "I love you, Harriet Turner," Archer said, his voice low and intense. "And in 1 month, I'm going to make you my wife. Nothing Clara or anyone else says can change that." For the rest of the evening they danced and talked with friends, deliberately ignoring Clara's presence. By the time they left, Harriet felt a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Her secret was out, and the world hadn't ended. If anything, she felt stronger for having faced Clara's attempt at intimidation head-on. The weeks leading up to the wedding passed in a blur of activity. Spring arrived in earnest, painting the ranch in green and filling the air with the scent of wildflowers. The last of the calves were born, healthy and strong. The hands, along with Archer, began preparing for the spring cattle drive that would take place shortly after the wedding. Harriet's dress was finished, a creation she was inordinately proud of. Simple yet elegant, it reflected both her St. Louis upbringing and her new life on the frontier, practical enough for a ranch wedding but beautiful enough to make her feel like a bride. The day before the wedding, a surprise arrived at the ranch in the form of a letter from California. It was from Archer's sister, Elizabeth, responding to the news of his engagement that he had sent months ago. "She's coming," Archer said in disbelief as he read the letter. "Not in time for the wedding, but she'll be here by mid-May. Says she can't wait to meet you." "That's wonderful," Harriet replied, genuinely pleased. She had heard so much about Archer's sisters that she felt she knew them already. "Will your other sister come too?" "Margaret's expecting a baby in June, so she can't travel," Archer explained. "But she sends her love and congratulations." The knowledge that she would soon meet at least one member of Archer's family added to Harriet's excitement. Despite all the hardship that had brought her to this point, she couldn't help feeling that her life was finally coming together in ways she could never have imagined that day on the bridge in Benton. The wedding day dawned clear and beautiful, as if nature itself approved of the union. The ceremony was to be held at the ranch, with Reverend Thompson from Benton's small church officiating. Guests began arriving, mid-morning neighbors, friends from town, and the few distant relatives Archer had managed to contact. Harriet dressed in her room, assisted by Mrs. Billings, who had become a surrogate mother figure over the past months. As she fastened the last button on Harriet's dress, the older woman stepped back to admire the effect. "You look beautiful, my dear," she said, her eyes suspiciously bright. "Archer is a fortunate man." "I'm the fortunate one," Harriet replied softly. "To have found him, to have been given this chance at happiness." Mrs. Billings squeezed her hand. "You deserve every bit of it." A knock at the door revealed Frank, looking uncharacteristically tidy in a freshly pressed suit. He had agreed to walk Harriet down the aisle, a role he was taking very seriously. "Ready, Miss Turner?" he asked, offering his arm. "Everyone's waiting, and the boss looks like he might jump out of his skin with impatience." Harriet laughed, taking Frank's arm. "We can't have that. Let's go make him the happiest man in Arkansas." The ceremony was held in the garden that Harriet had spent weeks restoring to its former glory. Rows of chairs had been set up facing a simple arch woven with spring flowers. Archer stood beneath it, looking more handsome than Harriet had ever seen him in his best suit, his face lighting up as she appeared on Frank's arm. The vows were simple and heartfelt, spoken with clear voices that carried across the garden to the assembled guests. When Reverend Thompson pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that went up from the crowd was enough to startle birds from nearby trees. The celebration that followed lasted well into the evening. Tables had been set up on the lawn, laden with food prepared by Harriet and several neighbor women. There was music, dancing, and more laughter than the ranch had heard in years. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the festivities, Harriet found a quiet moment to slip away to the porch, needing a brief respite from the joyful chaos. She was standing there, watching the light change over the land that was now truly her home, when Archer found her. "There you are," he said, coming to stand beside her. "I wondered where my wife had disappeared to." "Your wife," Harriet repeated, savoring the words. "That sounds wonderful." Archer slipped an arm around her waist, pulling her close. "Happy." "More than I ever thought possible," Harriet replied honestly. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. In the distance, cattle grazed peacefully, and the newly planted fields promised future abundance. It was everything Harriet could have wished for, and nothing she had expected when she'd stepped off that stagecoach in Benton months ago. "I love you, Harriet Edwards," Archer said, using her new name for the first time. "And I love you," Harriet replied, turning to face him fully. "Thank you for finding me that day on the bridge, for offering me your ranch when I had nowhere else to go. Best decision I ever made," Archer said with a smile, bending to kiss her softly. As they turned to rejoin their guests, Harriet took one last look at the ranch at her home. From desperate beginnings had come this beautiful new life, this love that filled her heart to overflowing. Whatever the future held, she would face it at Archer's side, secure in the knowledge that she had found where she truly belonged. 5 years later, Harriet stood on the same porch, watching as Archer taught their 4-year-old son, James, to ride his first pony. Their 2-year-old daughter, Lillian, babbled happily in Harriet's arms, pointing at her father and brother with obvious delight. The ranch had prospered beyond their expectations. Archer's innovative breeding program had produced cattle that fetched premium prices at market, and Harriet's suggestion to diversify into horses had proved equally successful. The Edwards Ranch was now one of the most respected in the state. The house had grown along with their family, with new rooms added for the children and improvements that combined comfort with practicality. Harriet's garden had expanded to include vegetables that supplied not only their table, but also brought income when sold in Benton. Clara Whitfield had eventually returned to St. Louis, her attempts to cause trouble for Harriet and Archer having failed completely. The people of Benton had embraced Harriet fully, valuing her contributions to the community and respecting the strength she had shown in rebuilding her life. Archer's sister Elizabeth had indeed visited that first May and had returned each year since, bringing her husband and children to meet their Arkansas cousins. Margaret had come the following spring with her new baby, resulting in a joyful family reunion that healed old distances. Frank, George, and Daniel remained loyal hands on the ranch, though George had recently married a widow from town and moved into a small house Archer had built for them on the property. They were like extended family now, especially to James, who followed them around adoringly whenever he could escape his mother's watchful eye. "Mama, look," James called as the pony took its first careful steps with him on its back, Archer walking beside them with a steadying hand. "I see you, darling," Harriet called back. "You're doing wonderfully." Lillian wriggled to be put down, and once on her feet, she toddled determinedly toward her father and brother. Harriet followed, laughing at her daughter's stubborn independence, a trait she had clearly inherited from both parents. Archer scooped Lillian up with one arm, settling her in front of James on the pony. The little girl shrieked with delight, her hands immediately reaching for the pony's mane. "Another natural horsewoman," Archer observed proudly. "Like her mother." Harriet smiled, remembering her own initially tentative relationship with horses. She had learned to ride shortly after their marriage, discovering an unexpected talent for it. Now she often rode out with Archer to check the herds or simply to enjoy the vast beauty of the land they called home. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in colors that still took Harriet's breath away, even after 5 years, the family made their way back to the house. Dinner would be waiting prepared by the cook they had hired when Harriet found herself expecting Lillian, though Harriet still insisted on making Archer's favorite dishes herself on special occasions. Later, after the children were tucked into bed with stories and kisses, Harriet and Archer sat on the porch swing, a nightly ritual that allowed them to connect after the busy day. Archer's arm was around her shoulders, Harriet's head resting comfortably against him as they gently swayed. "Do you ever think about that day we met?" Archer asked, his voice thoughtful. "On the bridge in Benton." "Often," Harriet admitted. "How close I came to missing all of this. If I'd arrived a day earlier or later, if you hadn't been in town that day. I believe we would have found each other somehow," Archer said with the quiet certainty that was so characteristic of him. "Some things are meant to be." Harriet smiled, thinking of all the twists of fate that had brought her to this moment, even the painful ones. Her father's death, Henry's abandonment, the desperate journey west, all had led her to Archer, to this ranch, to the family they had created together. "I told you I had nowhere to go," she reminisced. "And you said, 'Then my ranch is already yours,'" Archer finished, the words as meaningful now as they had been that day. "Best offer I ever made." "Best offer I ever accepted," Harriet replied, tilting her face up for his kiss. As the stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky, Harriet Edwards, once a desperate young woman with nowhere to turn, gave thanks for the journey that had brought her home to the man she loved, and the life they had built together, a life richer and more fulfilling than anything she could have imagined when she stepped off that stagecoach in Benton all those years ago.